Well, hello everyone. My name is Emilio Cordova. I am Grandmaster from Peru, and today I will have the pleasure to teach you actually a little bit about the Hedgehog, one of my main weapons, I would say. The good news about the Hedgehog is actually it's a system, not just mainly an opening, which is something different than probably you will have hear about, I don't know, Sicilian and many other openings like Opocensky, London or whatever. Hedgehog is a system, so it works in a different way because actually it's about just building the setup of the structure. So this is the main position that of course you're hoping to get whenever you are planning to play the Hedgehog, and I want to start from basically from the beginning. Whenever you're planning to study an opening, I think one of the most important things that you have to understand and you have to learn, it's about the regions of the opening. That I think that's actually quite important, and that's probably the most important thing that most players tend to skip or tend to miss. Actually, when they are starting to study any opening, they start to think about what the engine has to say about one specific structure, one specific position. And based on my experience, I would say that actually that's probably not the right approach. At least not if you are starting to play, or if you really want to move from, let's say, from being a strong player and being a FIDE master or maybe international master. That I think that's actually quite important. Because I have some news for you. Normally, computer could say something, but actually you will play the game, not the computer. So actually, the Hedgehog is what you are seeing at this moment. It's a very flexible pawn structure where actually, of course, one of the main ideas is to create the pawn breaks. Whenever you are getting into the middle game, you have to consider the pawn breaks, of course. And as usual, in the middle game, the most important part is two things, I would say, basically. How to maneuver with your minor pieces, saying like bishops and knights, and how to work with your pawn structure. Considering the pawn breaks is something important. And I want to introduce this very simple move. Not just to say that this is kind of the best move in the whole position, but the main thing in this position is whenever you castle your queen, I will call this as a castling your queen. Basically what you are doing is completing your Hedgehog setup, and then of course your main idea will be to play potentially like the bishop bringing to c7, rook to d8, maybe the rook on e8, because in that way you will get some pressure on the column, and potentially maybe playing something like d5. I'm showing you this position as the main setup, and this is the position that you are hoped to get, so that's actually very important. And as you can see, everything is really well coordinated. The knights are supporting to each other, the bishops are always, I would say, from the third rank to behind, I think it's better. And of course, I always consider them pawn breaks. We are going to understand that in a minute. I'm just showing you this because I consider this as the main setup, so that's actually very important for you to understand. Because whenever you're playing the Hedgehog is a very flexible system. It's an extremely complex system to play that actually you could try to play not just with black, but with the white pieces too. Sometimes when I'm feeling like I'm tired, I don't want to prepare, let's just play chess, I want to go just with the Hedgehog because it's a system, as I said, so you can just build up your whole pawn structure. So let's start just from the beginning, how you could get into the Hedgehog. That I think that's actually one of the most important parts about any opening. So let's start with the very old game that it was played between Opocensky against Saemisch. Well, Saemisch is like, well, back in the 1800s or 1900s. And of course, he elaborated this system. I was very surprised when I was doing my research about the Hedgehog, and I realized, because I really like whenever I'm studying any opening to start from the origin, how this opening was conceived and so on. Because nowadays with the computer immersion is kind of tricky and it's very hard to understand a little bit about any system. So in the Hedgehog you could start in many different ways, but in this case it was started with e6. So the whole point is now you're playing a pulsing structure, very famous of course, and as I said, the Sicilian is about being flexible, so you have to understand that. That's the most important part. In Sicilian you need to understand that is one key square that you need to control, and it's about d5. So whenever you're starting to play or study any opening, be sure to know the plans and the pawn breaks. That's actually very important because I have seen many players that they, of course, whenever they are preparing, whenever they are working, they just repeat whatever the computer have to say. But that's actually not the right approach, because maybe they are a lot of different moves. So it's very important to understand the quality of the pawn structure and how to create and in which moment to create a pawn break. That's actually very important. So has computer, let me just, has computer analysis determined any opening to be truly superior? Just to answer that question, because I think it's related to what I was saying, not really. I mean, computer have some preference about, let's just say, classical way of playing chess, like e45, controlling the center. That's actually always very important. But if you really want to win a game, I will recommend you to not stick to whatever computer has to say, because you need to understand first. Chess is about understanding. If you have better understanding than your opponent, then you will make the difference. So let's just go directly to the hedgehog. Pawn takes, knight takes, and now pawn to a6. As I said, Sicilian is about flexibility. It's a little bit different. You build up your pawn structure first, and then of course you will try to create an efficient pawn break. This is, we are building the hedgehog, as you can see, pawn on c4. Now we are facing the Maroczy vine. Of course, in the Maroczy vine, what you're hoping to get is like you have more space, but at the same time, your whole point with this structure is, of course, to gain more and gain more control and more space. That's the whole point of the Maroczy vine. This is actually the Maroczy vine. It's a very well-known structure among players, of course. So now queen on c7, you can see that we are completely ignoring the knight pieces development. But what I really want to do is just to control key squares. The Sicilian is about controlling key squares, and when the right moment arrives, maybe to play d5, maybe to play b5, maybe even to play e5. In the hedgehog, it's about being able to recognize when is the critical moment to inflict the right pawn break. That's actually very important. So knight comes to c3, knight comes to f6. Of course, this is the right moment to play the knight, or to bring the knight to f6, because now I cannot play e5. And now bishop to e2. Of course, remember, this game was played in, well, a kind of 1800, 1900, like quite a long ago. So chess, it was different. It was seen in a different way, actually. So now black plays b6. Now we are building the hedgehog. The whole point of playing b6 is to play bishop on b7, pointing against the pawn on e4, and now we are able, of course, to play the hedgehog. We are building the hedgehog. Don't forget that. It's about building the structure. Whenever you are starting to learn any opening, learn from the structure perspective. That's very important. Don't memorize move. Memorize what is the type of structure that you want to get, what is the most logical maneuvers with the minor pieces, not the heavy pieces actually, the minor pieces, saying like bishops and knights, and of course the transitions into endgames. But that's probably for a different day. So b6. Now bishop on e3 and bishop on b7. We are pointing against the pawn on e4, of course. We are putting some pressure against this pawn, and now f3. White, of course, build up the Maroczy vine, and black is building the hedgehog. So that's the whole point. I have a very flexible structure, and white has more space. So space is a type of an advantage, of course. It's an advantage. But whenever you're grabbing a space, you need to always be able to control the space that you are gaining. It's not like just overexpanding. We are going to see some examples that will happen, and will show what in the hedgehog actually is very important to not, as white, to not overexpand, because then you actually could get easily punished. So f3, and now we build the hedgehog. Remember, in the previous minutes, we just saw the position that we want to get. So this is very important. Whenever you're starting to play an opening, you have to understand where do you want to go, which position you want to get. It's very important. That's actually the most important thing, not just to memorize move. It's the position that I want to get. What is the right setup that I want to get? That's very important. So pawn to d6, queen to d2, and now knight b to d7. Once again, the hedgehog is about being flexible, considering some knight jumps, maybe putting some pressure against the pawn on c4, and potentially, of course, bringing the rook to c8. So now we are just building this structure. Castle was played, and now bishop on e7. One of the most logical plans for white nowadays, of course, is to play a4, a5, and try to create some pressure against the queenside pawns. That is one of the main ideas for whites. Of course, here white has a lot of ideas in general, but a4, a5, I would say, is probably the best way to inflict some pressure against the black's pawn structure. Not all the players know about this plan. Most likely, players, they tend to go like rook on d1, rook on c1. They has been taught to, and they has, of course, they know that the rook has to come to the center first in order to get more control, and then, of course, try to create or gain more space on the queen side. But I think, based on my experience on this structure, that it's better just to play a4. And probably, and this is a very important moment actually, if you start with a4, then you will ask, well, what if I play something like a5? What is the problem with that move? I would say actually, whenever you're making a pawn move, a weakness emerges. And this is a rule. So this is very important. But whenever you're making a pawn move, a weakness emerges. So it's very important. But not all the weaknesses are relevant. Not all the weaknesses matters. Not all the weaknesses are hard to defend. But in this case, yes, indeed, the b5 square. The b5 square will be very weak. And you have to understand one thing. When I'm saying a square, you immediately, the first piece that should come to your mind must be the knight, not bishop. Bishops is about diagonals, columns, queens, and rooks. But the squares belongs to knight. So that's very important. Whenever you're seeing a weak square, always try to bring your knight there. And of course, the knight will come to b5, queen comes to d8, and being coherent, it means, of course, to kind of connect the dots in a sense, I would say. The knight is putting some pressure against d6, so basically this pawn to a5 is something that you should not do in the hedgehog. That's actually very important. And this is a practical advice that I want to give you. If you have no clue what to do in any position, no clue at all, it is actually very important to at least be sure about the things that you should not do. And you should not play a5 if your king is still in the center. That's actually very important. So for instance, in this position, how white will continue the pressure in this? How can you increase the pressure against the d6 pawn, for instance? Because that's the pawn that you're putting some pressure here. What would you say? How could you increase the pressure against this pawn? There is any clear way that you could try to do that? Well, of course, you're putting pressure with the queen too. You could try to bring maybe bishop to f4, for instance. That will be another opportunity, or just rook to d1. It could be rook f to d1 or rook a to d1. So in both cases, you will be doing well. And I want to make I will give you an advice, practical advice in this type of positions, because it's very important to understand one thing. So you have probably bishop f4 as a possibility. But of course, whenever you're playing bishop f4, what you're doing wrong in this case is like you're moving the same piece twice during the opening. And that's the thing that normally you should not do, or at least consider just if it's good enough. Against bishop f4, if I don't have ways to defend this pawn, then I would say yes, probably bishop f4 will be great. But always try to consider to bring or to create more pressure with the pieces that are undeveloped. In this case, the rook on f1, for instance. The rook on f1 is it's kind of developed, but it's not active. If you go bishop f4, I could play knight to e5. So, of course, this will be just it's the transition from the opening to the middle game. So that's actually very important. And whenever you play rook f d1, of course, the pawn on d6 will be a big problem and will be very weak. So we are going to see actually why it's not so good to play a5, to start with a5, because then you will suffer. The pawn on d6 will suffer. So let's just go back. So in the hedgehog, that's the why it's actually very important to control the key squares. In this case, d5 and b5. This is very important, and I will add, in all the Sicilians, there are two squares that you need to understand. This is not about just the hedgehog. As I said, the hedgehog is a structure, is a system, and it's actually very important to know some key squares. So in all the Sicilians, the key squares are related to pawn on the square on d5 and a square on f5 too as well. So it is actually very important to understand that detail. So bishop on e7 was played, and now rook f to d1. Now we just castle immediately. As I said, against a4, what you should do? Well, literally ignore the pawn to a4. You just castle. And of course, if you play with a5, you just can bring the rook to c8, or even though you could try to bring the other rook too as well. And if you want to take me on b6, I want to take with the knight back, and then I will be putting some pressure against the c4 pawn. And of course, I will be creating some potential pawn breaks, like maybe d5 at some point if you go b3, maybe some d5, and of course, I'm breaking the position. I putting some pressure against the structure, because overall, that's the main idea in this type of setups. In the hedgehog, mainly, it's actually about being able to react. If you don't react in the hedgehog, if you cannot play neither b5, neither d5, neither e5, and you will see more examples about that, then it's a bad hedgehog. If you are not able to react, it's a bad hedgehog. In this case, you are able to react because you can inflict some pressure by playing d5. So actually, that's very, very, very important in this case. So I will show you some examples about this position, but let's just first finish with the setup. Rook f2 d1, castle, rook a to c1, and rook a to ca. Why the rook and a? Because we want to castle the queen, basically. I would say castle the queen because it's the easiest way to see it. But whenever you bring the queen to va, you are improving your queen, because in that way, you will not be under any potential attack by bringing the knight on d5, creating some sacrifices ideas by putting some pressure against the queen on c7, and so on. So that's why rook a to ca. Now bishop to f1, it was played, and now we are heading into the position that is kind of building the hedgehog. And now once we build up the hedgehog, actually here are a lot of ideas. So this is actually, once you get into this position, is when, let's just say, the opening stage of the hedgehog ends. Now is when the middle game patterns that you need to incorporate in your chess DNA would say, you need to, of course, be at least aware about the ideas. What are the ideas on the hedgehog? Of course, I have been mentioning about playing b5, playing d5, potentially playing e5, but e5 you should most likely not play. And this is a very simple question. So for instance, in this case, why play queen f2, which is probably not the best way. Nowadays, it is well known that for white it's better to start to expand a little bit on the queen side. But I want to ask you, if I play queen to f2, playing e5 will make sense or not really? What would you say, actually, if I go with pawn to e5? Remember, we just finished our setup. The hedgehog has been basically will build up very well the hedgehog. So now the question is if playing something like e5 will make really sense in this position or not. What would you say about that? This is good because it's actually about understanding the structure. That's actually very important. And it's, I would say that you have to be very careful whenever you're making a pawn move, because whenever you're making a pawn move, a weakness emerges. So why putting the pawn on e5 will be bad? If you have any idea, you could mention that, of course. Because we are trying to get rid of the knight on d4. But the problem with the pawn on e5 is, like, once again, knight to f5, and then we will be suffering, not just because the f5 is square, but the knight on e7, the bishop on e7 will be under a lot of pressure. So that's why this will be a very, very bad idea. So now the main idea how to play this type of position is, of course, one idea is to play bishop on d8 and then bishop on c7. This is one of the main plans on the hedgehog. So whenever you start to work in any opening, let's just say you're in move 14, 15, that is kind of preparing like a pro. If you want to prepare like a elite player, then you will have to go further, probably till move 25 or something like that. Even probably more than that. Knowing all the endgames is will be very useful in general. But for a practical player, for a practical point of view, being able just to recognize I would say the first 15 move is good enough. So bringing the bishop on the a and then bishop on c7, so just to illustrate better, if I bring the bishop on c7 and then all of a sudden you ignore my move, how black should react, for instance, here? Remember, you already built up the hedgehog. Whenever you castle, your queen is on b8, your bishop on e7, you already build up the hedgehog. Of course, The best case scenario will be to have the rook on e8 because potentially you could open up the e5. So let's just say I put the rook on e8, and this will be a dream come true for any Hedgehog player. So now the question is how to play, how to react. Because of course, you know how to put the pieces, you know that your pieces are doing very well, but you have to play, you have to do something. What you should do, how you should play, how you should react. Once again, reacting is about confrontation, it's about confronting your opponent. So remember that in the Hedgehog was about pawn breaks. So there is a difference between pawn break and pawn move. Pawn move will be e5, pawn move will be g6, pawn move will be h6. What it will be a pawn break, a useful pawn break in this position, for instance, just to understand better the position. What would you say? How you should play in the Hedgehog? Remember, we were discussing about potentially playing b5, maybe playing d5. So of course, b5 looks like very hard to achieve, because if we play, well, of course, b5 is like white has a lot of pieces controlling b5, right? So normally, and this is very important to know, when you're playing against the Maroczy vine, I would say the best way to react, and especially when the bishop is on f1, the best way to react is always playing with d5. Always playing with d5. That's the main thing. You react with d5. That's the right way to do it. Because whenever you're playing d5, this is what it means coherence. You're activating your queen and your bishop, and you're putting a lot of pressure against the pawn on h2. So now you're making your pieces more efficient. Now they are working together. If you want to take, I could take. You want to take, and now I can take here. And of course, now you could see the benefits of bringing the queen on b8, the bishop on c7, the rook on e8, and the rook on c8. So always remember, this is kind of the main setup. This is kind of a dream come true for any Hedgehog player. You are not planning to gain space. Your whole plan with this system is to react and to inflict some pressure, reaction in the center. So that's why considering something like d5 is the main thing that you have to understand in this type of positions. So always, whenever you're starting to study any opening, it's actually very important to always keep reminding to yourself, what is the best way to react in this structure? What is the right setup? So as I said, if you get into this, now it's time, basically will be a good time for you just to start to play. So whenever you're studying in an opening, always remember what is the right setup, how I want to put my pieces, and what is the plan. And when I'm saying the plan, I'm referring basically to consider the pawn breaks. And if you want to go further, of course, consider the transitions into an endgame. Transitions into an endgame is something very important, but that's going further. And that is, as I said, kind of elite player, I would say. So this is very important, and this is a very good example. And as I said, this is the right setup that you want to get. Always the queen on b8, rook on c8, rook on f8, bishop on b7. Let's just be clear about this. This is actually one of the most important things that you have to understand about the Hedgehog. So there are many ways to face the Hedgehog. This is one way. This is against, let's say, against the e4 players. This structure. As I said, you want to play with d5, you want to play queen b8, bishop d8, and bishop on c7. So that's actually very, very, very important for you to understand. So always remember how to play with d5. And as I said, queen on f2, and then bishop on d8. There is another plan about the Hedgehog here, by the way. And this was implemented, I think, by Bobby Fischer after, a lot of years after, actually, because this was played first by Saemisch. So after king h8, and of course, knight on c2, if, well, actually Saemisch played a very nice game. But there is another plan in the Hedgehog. That's the why I really love the Hedgehog to play quite a lot. Because in this position, the other plan, the alternative plan, is like playing with rook on g8. But first, the best diagonal for your bishop to be is the bishop on c7. Once again, the bishop on c7. This how this game was played, actually. And after pawn to g3, there is this other idea that I consider very important. Rook on g8. So you might think like, what is the point of putting the rook on G8? What is the purpose of bringing the rook on G8? So whenever, once again, you're playing any open in any game, maybe reviewing the game with the computer, you have to understand the move. You don't play just the move because you want to play. You have to understand it first. So if the computer suggests rook G8, what is the purpose of the rook coming to G8? What do you think, actually? Why I put the rook on G8? Because I want to get mated maybe with some knight on G5 and knight on F7. Why did I put the rook on G8? What is the purpose of the rook on G8? Every move has to have a purpose. And the purpose of the rook on G8, you could guess. What do you think it is? Any idea about what to do? Maybe, sorry? G5. Of course, G5, G4. Yes, indeed. You want to play G5, G4, and then just to attack. And actually, it's very hard to prevent G5. I mean, how can you stop G5? I don't know. If you play H4, this is very bad. Why is very bad? This is actually a big mistake, kind of. Why is that? Because remember, the hedgehog is about kind of provoking your opponent to expand. It's kind of, okay, I'm allowing you to grab a lot of space, but whenever you're grabbing a lot of space, you have to be able to control it. So if you are not able to control or to protect the space that you are gaining, then you will be in very big problems. And remember, whenever you're making a pawn move, a weakness will emerge. That is a rule. I just play H4. Now, of course, this guy is very weak. So how can you try to take advantage of that? Yes, indeed. After E5, this exploding. Explosive. So, if you're playing the hedgehog, classical Sicilian, the dragon, the Timon of the Can, the Poulsen, all the type of Sicilian, there is one move that match with all the Sicilians, and it's D5. Whenever you're playing D5 in good conditions as black, you will get in a very nice position. So it's very important to understand the right pawn break, the right maneuvers too. And of course, if you play D5, then you're just taking everything. So no need for further explanation. The whole position is just entirely collapsing. But why it works? Well, basically because you have your pieces on the right squares. That's the why. So that's the why it's very important not just to take it lightly, like, okay, let's just play the Catalan, and then you have no clue what are the maneuvers, what is the best piece, what is the pawn break, what is the right transition. So it's very important to understand that, or which type of a structure is better than the other. So, and if you don't play H4 and you play B4, then you could play G5 and H5 and keep trying to break more of your pieces. And of course, I'm going further. This is normally when I stop. And this is not opening preparation. This is basically, I would say, open and middle game preparation. Because you have to know openings and middle game, they are linked. You cannot pretend to play the opening without the middle game information, basically. And, well, of course, in this structure, black will be creating a lot of mate threats around the white skin. So that's why I would say this is a very, very delicate position to play, no matter what. So, as I was saying, always remember the right setup that you want to get. Of course, if you got this position, then you're good to go, basically. Then you're good to play. But knowing all these maneuvers, it will definitely help you quite a lot. And of course, in the hedgehog, it's not about weakening yourself. As black, of course, you are just basically consolidating and controlling a lot of key squares. And whenever the right moment arrives, you play D5. That's when the right moment arrives. Not before. Just when you have all the pieces in the right place, and when you detect, when you observe that my opponent creates a lot of weaknesses, like playing H4, like playing D3. Whenever you see a weakness, you have to try to press it. So that's very important. So now let's just take a look over one very interesting example that I consider one of the most finest games. Of course, it's very hard, I would say, to explain everything about the hedgehog in just 1 hour or even 2 or even 10 because the hedgehog is very big. And I remember when I was reading the Shipov book, actually, about the hedgehog, there are 2 books, it's very big. I learned a lot, and it was in Russian, and I have no clue, not even how to say hi. So, but it's a very good book, and you could find that on Amazon probably too as well. You will learn a lot, because learning the hedgehog, learning any um, structure will definitely help you to improve your rating by at least, I would say, around 100 to 200 points, your understanding. So it's not about memorizing move, it's about memorizing the right patterns, the right ideas, what is the right moment when you can do any pawn break. And now we will see that in this very interesting example from the gameplay between Bobby Fischer against Ulf Andersson. And Bobby played the hedgehog, but with the opposite colors, with white. B3 is a good way to start, of course. Nowadays, Magnus Carlsen has, well, playing B3, well, Magnus can play many things, of course, he's Magnus, but even Bobby, he tests his abilities on this structure, because he was tired of openings, of course, and he tried to build up once again the hedgehog. So we are playing the hedgehog, but with opposite colors, and now you will see that. Bishop e7, pawn to a3. Of course, I want to play b4 at some point, but it's very important to understand, because probably you will say, but why am I not gaining a space? Well, whenever you're gaining a space, remember that, of course, you have to be able to control that space that you are gaining. So you have to basically be sure that you have enough pieces that can help you with that task. Otherwise, don't take a space lightly. It's very important to have enough arguments, enough soldiers that can help you to keep that space for yourself. So pawn to a3, castle. Now queen on c2 is very important actually in the hedgehog. Well, this is kind of the hedgehog with opposite colors, to complete your queenside pieces development first, normally. So queen on c2, rook to e8, and now pawn to d3. Was before possible? Yes, but we are learning the hedgehog. We are not learning the can, for instance. The can is different. So pawn to d3, we're building the structure. So that's why I really love to play based on systems, not based on opening knowledge purely. It's based on systems. So d3, bishop on f8, and knight to f3. Now we're heading into the hedgehog. a5 was played in order to prevent b4. Why not? So now bishop e2. The good news about playing systems is, like, it doesn't matter whatever your opponent could do, you could play that same system. Because, of course, it's about just developing your pieces and build up your structure, and then you will be able to go into the middle game. So, of course, bishop on e2, pawn to d5, you take, knight takes, and knight bd2. Now we are in the hedgehog. With opposite colors, of course, but the ideas are the same. And actually, I would say even a better version of the hedgehog, because not only in the hedgehog you will see a pawn on c5 or on c4 controlling more the center. Here, that is not the case. So you don't have even a space, and I will have my pieces in a very flexible squares. So knight b2 d2, f6, and now castle, of course. Castling is very important. But in this case, Mr. Bobby Fischer, he, instead of playing rook a to c1, which of course will be kind of building up the hedgehog, and then queen to b1, and then you start to play, he decided to not do that. And I think the reason was, like, if I go with rook a c1, there is no pawn that I could target on c5. So what is the point of bringing the rook on c1? So he, instead of considering this rook c1, he did something different. He applied the Saemisch plan, king to h1, in order to play rook to g1, and once again to play g4. That's what he applied. Of course, he could have done this, let's say queen d7, queen here, rook d8, bishop here, and then d4. Yes, of course. It's about learning and knowing the plans. It's about you. I mean, if you feel more comfortable with playing this plan, fine. But he thought that, okay, I'm playing against Ulf Andersson. He's an extremely very solid player. So why not to try to trick him very fast? So that's why he played king to h1, and he was very coherent. Back then, of course, this maneuver was not very well known among players. Nowadays, of course, it is. But even though that you know the maneuver, what would you do in order to prevent that? You don't want to play h5. Because remember, whenever you're making a pawn move, always a weakness will emerge. So, and of course, yes, this is the very famous game with the rook on g1 and g4 game. So now rook on g1, you have to be coherent. I mean, if you said I, you must say B. You play king h1. You will not say something like, okay, I play king h1, and then you will say, no, I regret it. let's just play something different. No, you already spent one move. And then you played rook g1, and then all of a sudden you decide that, you know, I don't want to play g4 and chicken out. Don't do that. You already spent 2 moves in order to play g4. And whenever you're playing dynamics positions, spending 2 moves is quite a lot. And of course, once again, this is a system. We are playing in the Hedgehog terms. This is not just based on the opening perspective. It's just based opening the middle game, of course. So I know it seems crazy to push the pawns on the king side, of course, but you have a lot of pieces. So you have to count your pieces. How many pieces do you have there? So instead of pushing the pawn to g4, first he just play knight on e4. Why not? If you play f5, then I could even try to play knight on c5 or knight on g5. And you should not forget, whenever you're making a pawn move, a weakness will always emerge. So that's why when f5 happens, now I have the opportunity to control not just to g5, but c5 squared too as well. And of course, then you will have a very, very, very nice position. In this case, unfortunately for Andersson, he just played queen to f7. Because the queen on f7, what is the purpose? Of course, I'm considering my own ideas, considering the fact of putting some pressure against b3. But okay, you're attacking, or you will be attacking my pawn, and I will be attacking your king. So of course, it's quite easy to understand which one matters more, right? Or which one is more fun to watch, at least. Pawn to g4. You already spent 2 tempies. King on h1, rook on g1. If the position is dynamic, you, of course, you have to, even though if you realize that the plan probably is not best, still, you already spent some 2 tempies, so why not? So g4, once again, this is one of the main ideas of the Hedgehog too. If you are not, of course, Bobby Fischer could have played d4, rook on d1, and so on. But he was in a creative mood, so that's why he decided to play with g4 and create some attacking conditions against the king. g6 was played, and of course, rook on g3. Probably you will ask what this has something to do with the openings. So whenever you're studying any opening, it is important, of course, to see some good examples. So let's just put it in this way. If you're studying the King's Indian, because you want to play the King's Indian, you have to study for sure Bronstein, Efim Geller, Kasparov, all the Ukrainian players on the 70s or 60s, and many other players. If you want to play the Najdorf, Kasparov, Bobby Fischer, MBL, and Lenier Dominguez, and many other players, of course. So whenever you want to play something, you have to, of course, take a look over the best game, the best players who are playing this. Don't make the mistake, this is my opinion, of course, to go directly to ask the engine. Because, of course, the engine will show you a lot of moves, a lot of ideas, and in all the positions, the engine, of course, will be able to hold, will be able, of course, to find good move or good ways to hold. But that's not the point. The point is whatever you are playing, you can understand it. And a way to understand it if you can explain it. If you can explain this position to somebody that has no clue about how to play chess, that means that you understand the position. So that's why it's very important whenever you are learning something, try to explain that. Let's say about the Hedgehog. Oh yeah, the Hedgehog was about playing d4. It was about being flexible with the pawn structure, always putting the knight in this way, the bishop on b2, the bishop on e2. But always the most important, be flexible with your ideas. That's the main idea of the Hedgehog, of course. And of course, considering to play with d4, but we are seeing an alternative plan. So rook on g3 was played, bishop on g7, and whenever you're attacking the king, always be sure, quantity over quality of pieces. It's better to have a lot of pieces. And of course, if you do the math, white has a lot of pieces here. And the bishop on b2 is pointing against the king side, and the queen is doing kind of sort of the same whenever the right moment arrives. So rook a to g1, and of course, knight on b6. Once again, I'm creating some targets against the pawn on b3. So even though when you're attacking, it's actually very important to pay attention to your opponent's intentions. Even if it's the most silly move, the most lazy move, whatever, it is extremely important to pay attention to that detail. When I play knight on b6, I'm creating some pressure against the pawn on b3. So in this case, you have to be mean. And of course, not allow your opponent to get any counterplay. So that's why you play knight on c5, putting some pressure against b7, Not really, but more important against the bishop on e6. And here it was a critical moment probably for black to try something more aggressive. I don't know if it's very hard his position, by the way. Maybe some bishop d4, bishop d5 to force white to go with e4 and then see if I could try to dirty the position a bit, muddy the position a bit, but it's not easy though. It's a very hard position to play already. So now the bishop on c8, and since all the white pieces are really well placed, now it's a good moment for white to inflict more pressure, but not just with the pawn break, but with a very nice maneuver with the knight. Knight to h4. What I want to do in this case is to play knight to f5. That's my whole idea. Why? Because whenever I'm opening the G file, of course, my two rooks will be able to play. So that's why I play knight to h4. It's not because the knight is a good looking piece there. It's because I will be able to bring the knight to f5. Knight to d7 was played. Of course, trading some pieces will make sense. But now knight to e4. As you can see, I'm keeping my structure very healthy by now. But of course, I'm using the f5 square for my knight as an outpost. So knight to e4, because I don't want to trade pieces. As you can see, black has no good pieces. So knight to f8 was played. And of course, the next move has to be knight to f5. Very logical move, because I just play knight to h4. I need to find a way how to open up the G file, because if I'm not opening the G file, my rooks won't be able to play. So this is the other plan on the Hedgehog about using the G pawn, but you castle first, then you bring your king to the corner, then you bring your rooks. You're not touching the center actually, you're focusing mainly and only on the king side. And of course, when you play knight to f5, bishop to e6, knight to c5 once again, knight to e7, of course. I mean, whenever you are under a lot of pressure, it's very hard to hold, very hard. Probably some players will say, oh, but maybe he had this, computers say this and that. But when your king is under attack, it is very hard, extremely hard to defend precisely. So knight on c5, and that is a very famous quote that whenever Fischer was playing, he was always going forward, always. And I mean, Fischer was tremendously good. If you really want to improve your chess understanding, reading Fischer is something that you must do, because that guy was amazing. So knight to e7, and of course you don't want to take that knight, you want to take the bishop, because whenever you remove the bishop, now you will be able, of course, to create more pressure against the pawn structure. That's the whole point. That's why you take on g7. So now king takes g7, and now of course if you said I, you must say b. The next move is quite logical. Pawn to g5. Whenever you put some pressure against the structure, now of course your bishop will be involved in all the details about this game. Of course, knight to f5. As I said, you don't need to give anything to your opponent. Rook to f3, creating more pressure against the pawn on f6. Pawn to b6. And of course, you could retreat your knight if you want. It's not really necessary, of course, but you just take on f6. King to h8. Now takes on e6, and well, finally you play d4. The reason of playing d4 is to activate this bishop, and of course just to open up the whole war, because you have two bishops. Don't forget, whenever you're playing with the pawn structure, it's very important to understand the quality of the minor pieces that you have, not the heavy pieces, by the way. This is very important, because some players tend to think like, oh, the pawn structure matters based on the heavy pieces. No, matters more based on the quality of the minor pieces, saying knights and bishops. That's what it makes your structure good or not good. So after d4, you want to open up, because in that way you will be activating your bishops. And now your two bishops are active. And whenever your two bishops are active, well, then of course the game continues, but nothing very important in general. Then Fischer won in a few more moves, and the position is unholdable. So what I want you to understand is about the key ideas over the Hedgehog. I mean, because Fischer realized that he got the Hedgehog, he built the Hedgehog in the right way in this moment. And of course, he could have done something different. Yes, of course, he could have played rook c1, rook d1, bishop on f1, and then playing d4. Yes, indeed. That was one way to play. And probably if we turn on the engine, maybe the engine will agree with that. Like, that's the best way, simplest way. But of course, will have been able to beat Andersson? in this very simple and logical way? Maybe, maybe not, because it's very simple and it's very traditional. You are not creating some imbalance in the position. But whenever he just played king h1, of course that changed a bit, because it was kind of surprise idea. And of course g4, g5, the other idea about the well, in this position that is very, very famous, mainly for this game. And it was a masterpiece played by Bobby Fischer when he played rook g1 and these g4 ideas. So remember that in the Hedgehog there are a lot of pawn breaks, and I just want to be very clear about that. It depends against the structure that you are playing. But one pawn break is to play with g4, another pawn break is to play with d4, another pawn break is to play with b4. Normally these are a lot of pawn breaks. But now we will see one last but not least example about what about creating one h-pawn, actually. So let's just see if I have the example here. So remember that first you try to build up the structure. So let me see if this is the right example, because I'm not so sure. Maybe I got the wrong one. I think, oh yeah, this is the right example, yes. So once again, we are heading into the Hedgehog. We are facing the Maroczy vine. Of course, you cannot, by the way, you cannot really push the pawn to e5 because queen and a5. So as I said, and I want to keep repeating this, whenever you're starting to working in any opening, go to the origins and pick the most famous players who played that system. Because I could say, for instance, that, oh, you know, you should play the Petrov. It's a very good opening. Probably yes, but I will not consider myself able to teach about the Petrov, because I never played the Petrov, right? I could explain from computer's perspective, but I cannot say what are the main ideas on the Petrov, because I never played the Petrov. So that will be ridiculous. But if you hear someone like, let's say, Kasparov saying about, you have to play the Najdorf for these and that, of course you have to listen to him. He played all his life the Najdorf, so that's the point. So always that's very important for you to understand. Whenever you're studying any opening, learn about who are the best players who play that constantly, consistently at least. So in this system, once again, the Hedgehog, g3 is played. Of course, one thing is very important. Whenever you're seeing the bishop is coming, you have to bring your bishop too. So bishop comes to b7, queen on c7. Of course, whenever the bishop is here, very important to always bring the queen here to protect your bishop, because there are some tricks related, like, for instance, to illustrate. Like if you go here and your bishop is unprotected, there is this trick. You play e5, I take here, and of course I will be taking your bishop. If you take my rook, I take your bishop, and then we have two minor pieces for the rook. And probably you might say, like, according to the engine or according to the math, this is kind of round even. But during the middle game, if you have queens especially, two minor pieces are stronger than a rook and two pawns, or a rook and a pawn. If you're heading into an endgame, that's a different story. But this is not an endgame. This is purely a middle game. So that's why whenever you're seeing that e5 is possible because the bishop is protected, so always just remember that detail about playing e5. So that's why you have to play queen on c7, guarding your bishop, because e5 was part of the idea. So now bishop to e3, simple but quite easy to understand. Whenever you have no clue about what to do, be sure about the things that you should not do, especially in the opening. If you are playing a position that you have never seen, of course, then you are kind of afraid about the thing that could happen. Don't try to take the initiative or seize the initiative right away. Don't try to capture pawns very fast, because most likely you will get punished. So for instance, why capturing the pawn on c4 will be a terrible idea here? There are many explanations for that move, of course, but there is just one simple way to punish something like this. And it's a very common idea actually here. Whole white will take advantage of the queen on c4. e5 could be an idea, of course, but there is a difference, of course, here, because my bishop is not on e7. So whenever I'm taking on f6, I'm not taking the pawn on e7. Sorry, the bishop on e7. But the queen, I mean, since probably when we learn to play chess, it's very well known that don't bring your queen out so fast or early on the opening. So, because it's a very powerful piece and could be under attack. So it's very important in the hedgehog that the only piece that should capture on c4, it should be a knight or a rook, not the queen. The queen is not a piece that should capture on c4 unless that you're 100% sure that that is a great idea. But after rook c1, yes, indeed, you will be under a lot of pressure. Now the knight will come to d5, and your queen has in a predicament, actually. It's a very hard position. Even if you go here, I could do this, you take me, could do this, and well, you're under a lot of pressure. It's a very hard position to play. So the hedgehog, remember, is not about reacting right after the opening. No, no, no. It's about you first be sure about building the right setup, and then you react. Not before. First, you build the setup. This is what black did, actually. Building the setup first. Don't try to go d5. Don't try to go e5. Don't try to go b5. No g5, no h5. No. First, build your setup. Rook on ca, bishop on e7, and I'll basically one move away of completing my system. Next move, I will be playing castle. Whenever I play castle, then done. I build up the hedgehog. However, white makes the very bad decision of playing g4. And that is overexpanding. That is overexpanding, and this is actually the very simple example of simple way of punishing something like this. Normally when you play g4, that pawn needs to be protected by a pawn, not just by a queen. And now this is one of the, I would say, good things about the hedgehog, that you could be actually very flexible all the time just by playing h5. And when you play h5, actually you're putting pressure against this guy. And if you take me, of course, I can take with a rook. And this is very funny because you will say, okay, but I was taught that normally I should try to castle, right? How I'm castling here? Well, castling is about securing your king. So in the hedgehog or in any Sicilian, you have to be open and being able to do that castle by hand too as well. You can just play king to f8, maybe g6, king on g7, and then you castle your king. Or you secure your king in a sense. But I can guarantee you that the white king is weaker than the white king, than the black king for sure. So when you play h5, you will see g5, but then knight to g4. And of course, this is a very hard position because I'm able to take your bishop, putting pressure against your pawn, putting pressure against this guy, and even more important, connecting my queen with the pawn on h2. That's another important thing. So the bishop go back, and now, of course, d5. The main move in the hedgehog once again. And now, of course, you can see that the pawn on h2 will be under a lot of pressure, and of course, whenever you play d5, now you will be winning. So, once again, in the hedgehog, there are a lot of ideas that you have to keep in mind, but it's always about reacting. It's about whenever you detect, you see that your opponent is overexpanding, then you react. But the most important thing is, of course, first, build up the right setup. It's not about just moving pieces around and then just having no clue about what to do. No, first, what black did well here, it was, take a look, I have my hedgehog built. So whenever you have this set up, then is the right moment basically that you could, of course, especially whenever you detect your opponent makes something weird like playing g4, okay, maybe I could punish you because I'm overexpanding my position with playing g4. And of course, that's the way h5 works. I'm not saying that you should play, for instance, if I go, let's say b3, you should play h5. To be honest, you could play h5 and probably computer will say that it's fine. But I would recommend you probably to not do that and just to castle and learn to play in the right way, or to play queen b8 too as well. Because then you're giving you, basically you're giving your opponent the chance to make a mistake. Maybe playing something like g4, g5, or something like that. And because it's always very important. If you, I have this very quite silly joke, like if you don't rely on your own technique, rely on your opponent's technique, for good or for worse, you know. Like if your opponent is Carson, yes, of course, you can rely on Carson's technique. But in this particular position, of course, you will give white a chance to maybe make a mistake like playing g4. So it's very important to remember that whenever you reach this position, then you can play castle, and of course you will up the hedgehog. But I just want to, just to finalize, I just want to add that when you're seeing this structure, that Phi and Kero structures, consider an h5 is fine. Because in that way you can, of course, try to target the pawn structure. And there are more examples about playing the h5, h4, even against the Maroczy variant as well. But it's about creating more weaknesses in the other side. So It's actually, as I said, many ideas in the Hedgehog, but it's very important to know that this is the right setup that you want to build. You will be white or you will be black, but as I said, if you're playing the Hedgehog, English, Petrov, neither, always very important. Try to learn about the pawn breaks, the logical pawn breaks, or the pawn breaks that makes most of the sense in this position. Try to know about the right maneuvers. Try to know about the transitions into endgames. And of course, always pick the right players to study. That's actually very important. If you are planning to study the Nairov, go with Kasparov. If you're planning to study the Catalan, go with Kragnin. So that's actually very important for you. Maybe there are more players than Kragnin. Don't go with the Stockfish first, because you won't understand a thing. That's very important, and you have to understand the position that you are going to play. I could say that, oh no, the Catalan is the best opening. Yes, maybe for me, but not for, I don't know, Laniers, for instance. Dominguez, he never plays Catalan, and he plays C4 always, or something like that. So it's very important. Opening is something very personal. So don't think because somebody says like this is the best opening, like the London system that everybody was playing like a few years ago, and nobody had clue about how to play the London. They were just bringing the bishop out and thinking that is the best opening. It's not a bad opening, of course. It's a normal opening, but you cannot be bad. I mean, you can be wrong if all of your pieces are out. So that's why I thought that learning about the Hedgehog could be something very beneficial for you, because it's about recognizing when is the right moment to create some tension, when is the right moment to do a pawn break. And I hope, of course, you learned something. But it's very important, as I said, whenever you're preparing openings, know about all these details that I just mentioned. Okay? And of course, stay around, because now we are going to move on. Time flies, by the way. And to learn how to calculate, because that's another important thing that you have to learn as a chess player. If you're not able to calculate, well, you are not able, of course, to play. But most important than calculating is to know when to calculate. What are kind of the patterns that we have to consider to know when we should calculate? Because we are not computers. So if we start to calculate all the time, of course, unfortunately, we will get tired. And learning when to calculate is the right moment. And that's what we are going to learn: calculation and understanding. Okay? So stay around. Okay? So